Welcome to today's webinar, Basic Income Towards Gender Equity. My name is Natasha Pei, and I am the manager of Cities Reducing Poverty. Before we get started making introductions to today's speakers, I'd just like to send a big thank you to Laura Katari and Tom Cooper and the folks at the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction for helping to assemble today's webinar, which is the latest in the learning series exploring basic income in Canada. I'd also like to introduce you to Deirdre Pike of the Hamilton Social Planning and Research Council, who's going to start us off with the land recognition. Deirdre.
Thanks, Natasha. Before we begin this important conversation, it's essential to ground it in the acknowledgement that from wherever we are joining this meeting today, and there are people from different parts of the world, for those of us who are non-Indigenous, we are settlers and we are guests on this land. The city in which I sit today, Hamilton, is situated upon the ancestral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee Confederacy land, and it's determined by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. It's also an area with long-standing relationships to the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Six Nations of the Grand River. I know, as I mentioned, there are participants from different parts of the world, but the majority of us are situated on Turtle Island today. No matter where you are, if you know the name of the traditional territory on which you sit or stand right now, please identify that. We're all muted. You could say it out loud or in the silence of your heart. We are grateful to the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island who have cared for these lands since time immemorial. We hold our hands up to their amazing resistance, resilience, and strength in the face of ongoing dispossession and colonial violence. To acknowledge these lands is to take one step in demonstrating our commitment to the process of dismantling the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. May we bring that same commitment and spirit of truth-seeking and reconciliation to our conversation today. And so be it.
Thank you for grounding our conversation, Deirdre. And I'd like to introduce everyone to today's guest moderator, Laura Katari. So thank you for being with us here today, Laura, and I'm going to hand it over to you to introduce today's fantastic speakers panel.
Great, thank you, Natasha, and thank you, Deirdre. I am located in Hamilton as well, and so I'm very grateful for that land acknowledgement. So many say COVID is a step back for the women's movement. Women are forced to stay home with lack of childcare, and a recent CCPA analysis on jobs cites slightly more women's jobs have seen the majority of hours cut or lost. But if you're a single parent, that number is 32% of you. Despite this, women are the majority of frontline workers today. My bias in all this, of course, is that basic income would be the best response in this scenario. But you don't need to hear from me today because we brought in some amazing panelists, talented and accomplished experts. So joining us today are Dr. Tracy Smith-Carrier. She's an associate professor in the School of Social Work at King's University College at Western University. And we have Ms. Josephine Gray, a human rights advocate, community organizer, and public speaker for more than 30 years. And last but certainly not least today is Dr. Evelyn Forget, an economist and professor in community health sciences at the University of Manitoba. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here today. So I'm going to take my moderator privilege for a moment and just say I have seen the presentation that I've asked Dr. Smith-Carrier, Tracy, to do for us. And I'm going to preface it by just asking, why is a gender lens needed?
So I think it's clear that COVID-19 has had a greater impact on women than it has on men. The World Health Organization reports that women represent 70% of health and social service providers worldwide. These are frontline workers that have the greatest exposure to the virus. According to Statistics Canada, more than half, or 56% of women in Canada, are employed in the 5 C's: caring, clerical, catering, cashiering, and cleaning work. Women have lost jobs at 2 times the rate of men. And for those still in paid labor, many have seen their hours significantly reduced, largely due to occupying jobs in the low-waged retail and service sector. COVID has increased women's exposure to intimate partner violence and has exacerbated a profound gendered division of labor. Arlie Hochschild in the 1980s talked about the second shift, or the double duty of women, one involving work in paid labor and the other involving a shift of domestic and caring work in the home. We're now seeing women having to do the triple shift: domestic work, paid work, and homeschooling of children. Relative to men, women are more likely to experience poverty, to shoulder the disproportionate share of caring labor and provisioning work, to be precariously employed in minimum wage jobs, to be paid less for the same work, to receive less in pension programs, to be abused or trafficked. And the multiple intersections that women occupy based on age, race, class, and disability, and so forth, compound the disadvantage and lead to increasingly more harmful health, social outcomes. The racialization of poverty. Women are 3 times more likely to experience poverty as members of racialized groups relative to non-racialized Canadians. We have little data on health and race in Canada. This is a gap that we need to see filled. Yeah, but in the context of COVID, what we do know is that there is an overrepresentation of Black people among frontline workers. A recent report by Buka and Buka found that 80% of the women working as aides in the long-term care homes in Montreal are racialized women. Also, ongoing systemic inequalities on reserves has resulted in greater exposure to the virus for Indigenous women and their families due to overcrowded housing conditions and the lack of access to clean water for regular hand washing. Over 80% of people on reserves have median incomes below the low-income measure. So why should we call for a basic income for women? Well, when we look at all the various domains of their lives, first looking at employment, there's significant research that affirms that offered as an adequate, non-conditional individual benefit, basic income could enable women's economic independence. Women would have greater choice to further their education or training, to start a business, to stay at home for a time to raise a family, or to leave a toxic job for a better one. They'd have more flexibility in determining their hours of work, with resources to pay for public or private childcare providers, for example, other family members. Basic income could also give women more bargaining power in employment. They could leave poorly paid positions to find better ones. Moreover, Baker in 2008 said that unpaid work would receive recognition, not as a payment for care work, but as a universal support for care work, providing everyone with a more effective opportunity to engage in it. A basic income would ensure mothers access to adequate housing options and would enable them to have the financial wherewithal to improve their housing prospects. It would provide more housing choices that meets families' bedroom and space requirements, increases their choice in neighborhood selection, and accommodation closer to important amenities. Access to finances or income is one of the most significant factors determining whether a woman stays or leaves an abusive relationship. So having a basic income would provide more choice for women if and when fleeing intimate partner violence, as well as in choosing a housing neighborhood that ensures the family's access to safety. Income is the single most important determinant of health. The lack of it results in a multitude of adverse health consequences. Research shows a strong connection between maternal and child health outcomes. So a basic income would improve the health and well-being of mother and child, including the food security of the family. The mental health of women would also improve as they experience the assurance of income stability. So what are the limitations? Well, the most commonly cited critiques against a basic income include first the cost argument, the second, the work disincentive argument, and for women specifically, the argument that basic income could reinforce or reify a gender division of labor. Yet these are not borne out in research. Basic income is not costly relative to the costs of our current system, which is very expensive. Basic income does not translate into significant reductions of labor force participation. It could, in fact, allow for a smoother transition to a more gendered division of labor. Basic income is not a panacea. It would not expressly resolve affordable housing issues, remedy the shortage of equality childcare facilities, or eliminate gender inequality in the short term. It would, however, immediately address the feminization of poverty that continues to beleaguer women in Canada. And it would give women more choices and opportunities in the many important domains of their lives.
Thank you. That is amazing. As an overview, I find this helpful. Just to kick us off, I hope our attendees do as well. I'm going to move over to ask Evelyn, given everything that we've just heard and what we've learned from BI and how it affects women, what can we say about how BI affects women from the BI experiments that have come before us? So basically, what do we know in areas that have already tested this?
Thank you, Laura. I'm joining you from Winnipeg today, which is in Treaty 1 territory, and it is also the homeland of the Métis Nation. We've actually had a lot of experience with pilots and experiments all over the world, in high-income countries like Canada, like Finland, in middle-income countries, and in low-income countries. And we've learned a lot about the different ways that basic income might affect women as opposed to men, and the different ways that it affects women at different points in their lives, and women who have different experiences and backgrounds. One of the things that we see very often is that after a basic income trial takes place, some of the strongest advocates for basic income are people who've participated in that experiment. And women are certainly overrepresented among them because basic income allows, in some cases, them to transform their lives in really significant ways. So what do we know about basic income? Well, it turns out that always and everywhere, no matter where you're conducting this experiment, women are more likely to be living in poverty. They're overrepresented among low-income families. They're more likely to be living with disabilities and with chronic health challenges. And therefore, basic income has a very profound effect on their quality of life. Basic income turns out to be particularly important when people are going through transitions in their lives. And that might be the transition out of an unsatisfactory relationship, as Tracy mentioned, or a transition into or out of the workforce as they take on greater or lesser responsibility for unpaid care work, for example. It turns out that women's lives are much more diverse than those of men, and they're very diverse even among women. And they change over the course of a lifetime as well. And what basic income does is it provides the resources for people to find their feet when they're moving through these transitions in their lives and decide how it is they're going to move forward. The particular ways that women are affected by basic income, though, depends on the context in which they're living. So our first basic income experiment in Canada, for example, took place in the 1970s in a small prairie town, and also in the city of Winnipeg. And women experience their lives in very different ways during that period than they do today in Canada or that they do in other parts of the world. So for example, if we look at the trials that have taken place in India or in sub-Saharan Africa, we see that women's health improved. But women's health always improves. But in those particular countries, it showed up in specific ways. So nutrition improved, maternal and child health improved. In Malawi, for example, girls were more likely to go to school, and they were also less likely to engage in sex work if their family received a basic income, which had profound effects on sexually transmitted infections, on AIDS, for example. But when you look at high-income countries like Canada, we're much more likely to see those improvements in mental health and in the ability to participate in one's community more fully. So if we think back to the first basic income experiment, for example, that took place in Canada, which was called Mincome, we saw the effects of empowering women because basic income always works by empowering women. It lets them overcome or compensate for failures in the system in which they're living. So they can identify the shortcomings that they're living with, and they can use the basic income to compensate for those shortcomings. So one of the things that we saw in Mincome, for example, and here I have to ask you to imagine yourself back into the 1970s in Canada. And what does that mean? It means if you're giving birth, for example, you're lucky enough to have maternity leave, which still doesn't happen everywhere, but your maternity leave was going to be 4 weeks long, and it was probably going to be unpaid. And it turns out that a lot of new mothers thought that a 4-week maternity leave was really kind of miserly. And so many of them used the basic income they received to buy themselves longer parental leaves. And that anticipated changes in the social programs that we've made subsequently. You know, we routinely allow women to take 12 weeks off with 12 months off with at least partial compensation now when they give birth, because we know that staying home with newborns is good for families, good for mothers, good for babies. So women recognize that limitation of the system far before policymakers did. And they use the basic income in order to improve the quality of their lives and the quality of their families' lives. But my point in all of this and everything I've said is that what basic income does is it allows individual people, it allows individual women to decide what they need, exactly what they need, and exactly how to meet their own unique and specific needs. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's a lot of questions answered for me and what it's looked like globally. So that's important information. Thank you for sharing that with us. So, Josephine, I am so sorry to do this to you. I'm going to ask you a question that's posed to me quite often. And I think it needs to be asked for those that are new to the basic income concept. So why can't we just raise social assistance rates? Why do we have to have this whole other program? What's the important change that you see besides the level of income?
Well, the level of income is a profound issue. I mean, people might think about the fact that the CERB was set at 2,000 because it was seen as necessary to meet people's needs, but meanwhile, welfare remained down around 600, 700 or less in other provinces. In the city of Toronto, that kind of money gets you absolutely nowhere. So the income piece is actually very, very important. But one of the reasons social assistance is more expensive than it should be is because it's a highly policed, intensively delivered program that makes a lot of assumptions about people, and it seeks to control and direct people's lives once they're on it. It's very, very conditional. And I have to say that, as a single parent, I became a single parent because I was an abuse survivor. And when I needed to turn to the system for assistance to raise my 4 children, I found the experience deeply distressing, humiliating, frightening. You always felt like you could be cut off at any moment. If you stepped out of the box they put you in, they might penalize you. And then I was given a contract by the Ontario government, which was doing social assistance reform, to tour the province and meet with people on social assistance and talk about what was wrong with the system. And it was so blatantly, glaringly evident how women in particular were negatively affected by this system. I met women in the far north who were absolutely helpless in the face of their abuser. They couldn't move, they couldn't go anywhere, they were being judged. People in small towns, experienced an enormous amount of stigma. The, local Reeve or social assistance administrator would sit in the office in the middle of town and watch people come and go and decide who they were going to cut off and threaten next because they saw them go to the beer store or something like that. It was just so abundantly clear that the system was dysfunctional and not designed to help anybody. And it certainly made it very, very difficult for people to make choices, to make moves in their lives that would lead them to employment, to greater economic security. And it became, in the end, it started to feel more and more as if those of us who are unfortunate enough to need help from our society, from the very tax money that we ourselves put in, and our parents and our community, it felt like we were becoming, and even more so lately, we become a resource for a poverty industry that benefits from our need. And it's a need that has been deepened and made more difficult and more permanent by the very way in which the system is designed. There are a lot of disincentives to go and try different jobs or to go to school. The student debt on top of social assistance, and then if you step out of that, you have to pay your student debt. My daughter was actually working in a very high level course. Now her income made her have to pay full payments on student debt. She wasn't able to afford a home. Like, she had to go through a lot of maneuvering to be able to work and afford a home as a single parent. So, our current system makes an awful lot of mistakes. It boxes people in. It respects no one's freedom. And I think, you may have a terrible poverty of money when you're in the social assistance system. But then again, those who are working 3 or 4 jobs or trying to survive outside the assistance system also have a terrible poverty of time. And between those two factors, we have a very, very hyper-controlled and struggling society, which is now, 60 to 70% of us are living in a precarious state, economic insecurity. So to me, basic income, it recognizes the fact that, we ourselves have to decide and determine how best to live our lives, raise our families, and be the best we can be in contributing to society. And at a time when we're facing climate chaos and extreme weather events and all kinds of uncertainties, a basic income is an absolute necessity to make sure that people can transition from, toxic jobs, or transition from careers that are making it impossible for them to have a healthy family life, or transition to be able to do, sustainable farming or urban gardening, or whatever it is that we are all going to need to be doing to adapt to, a new reality. So coming out of this pandemic, my hope is that, the taste of CERB has made people understand the importance of having this basic stability, this certainty, this ability to be adaptable and flexible and resilient. And, maybe this is our opportunity. So long as we ensure that our human rights are still and also protected, and it doesn't become a replacement for many other services, it's very clearly a much better response to poverty and instability.
Thank you for that. Sorry, I'm putting on my moderator hat and just checking time so we can get some questions from the audience. And sorry, allergy season. So the first question's a fairly easy one. I think for the purposes of this discussion, we'll be working with Basic Income Canada Network's definition of basic income. I think that's what most of us are involved in on the call, and that would be a basic income guarantee that ensures everyone has income sufficient to meet needs and live with dignity regardless of work status. And other than that, it would be program design. And for that, I think we can move on later in discussions, but I think for today, that's enough to sort of give us an outline. I have an open-ended question that I'm going to ask the attendees today. If you can start putting questions into our Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen, it says Q&A, and you can type a question in there. But in the meantime, I'm going to play devil's advocate with our panelists, and I am going to ask, what won't this resolve? And more in particular, what arguments have you heard from women about women against basic income? Who would like to step forward first and give that one a go? Our panelists, that is. Sorry, Josephine.
I'll make one little point.
Sure.
We need a much better and more healthy food system. Money alone will not get all of us access to healthy food. But then again, if we had basic income, people who produce food and grow food would have a lot more flexibility and ability to transition and change how we do our food growing and production. So it would take a while. So it wouldn't answer it on its own, but being able to have healthy, nutritious food is like a first and foremost basic need. And it also won't solve having enough affordable housing by itself either. It would certainly give us more choices, but we obviously have to do a lot of work around, returning to a model where, affordable housing was an important priority and was provided for because it is good for the economy and it is good for communities. So it doesn't solve that by itself, but it definitely gives people a lot more choices. I mean, right now in Toronto, there are students from downtown sharing, 4 students to a bedroom, never mind an apartment, because the rents are so high. And the basic income, if we didn't control rent, wouldn't solve that problem. But if we do control rent and we provide affordable housing, then it's, going to continue to assist and help people make better housing choices.
Thank you for that. And I fully agree. I think Tracy'd like to get in on this. So Tracy, what are you thinking?
I totally agree with what Josephine just said, but one of the arguments that I've heard quite frequently is the notion that if we get basic income, then basically we'll get rid of everything else, which I think is somewhat of a austerity mindset in terms of if we get this one program, it means that we won't have affordable housing, we won't have childcare, we won't have these other things. And we're living in a very prosperous country, one that has, trillions of dollars in assets. There is certainly money there to do basic income plus the other programs that we need. So most of the basic income advocates that I work with, we basically use the slogan basic income plus to say basic income as a supplement to all the other areas that we need for our lives.
I love that. Evelyn, did you want to touch in before we go to the questions that have just piled in for us?
I think I want to address the first question you asked, and what is a real limitation of basic income? And I think we have to acknowledge that basic income by itself is not going to address some of the sources of deep inequality in our society. It's not going to solve racism. It's not going to solve sexism. It's not going to ensure great equality across society and across the economy. All it does, and it's not a minor thing, all it does is it gives people the capacity to live as well as they can, given the society that we're living in, and it gives them the foundation to advocate for those deeper changes. It gives them the ability, Josephine talked about the poverty of time a minute ago. And what basic income does is it gives people a little bit of time to work on some of those deeper divisions that we're still going to have to address. So I think we do have to recognize that money is just money. And money is very important. I don't want to undermine that, but it's just money.
That's beautiful. And you're starting to touch on some of our questions out there. So I'm going to put out a few questions and you can sort of pick and choose which one you want to address. But first of all, I have an anonymous person talking about how brilliant Josephine is, and I agree. So I thought we'd just share that because it's important. So how do you see the difference between basic income and guaranteed livable income? Is there a difference? So even assuming that, does someone want to give that one a quick go? Just step up. Josephine.
I think it's a good point. In fact, recently there's been a number of questions I think are quite important about how do we ensure that the level of income reflects the cost of living in different areas and regions. Obviously, the cost of food is 5 to 10 times more in the far north, for example. Do we set, a level of the market basket of needs in that region? Like, how do we do that? I'm not sure. Or do we try to make it level across the board? That's a really important point. And I think one of the things that we have to be very, very vigilant about as we advocate for basic income is that it is a livable income. It has to be a livable income, because there are those on the sort of right-wing corporate elite side who would say, sure, give everybody $1,000 and let them, fight it out from there, cut everything else. So, the fact that the basic premise is that it's going to respect an adequate standard of living and basic needs is really, really key.
So thank you for that. Next up, we have basically, what do you recommend as steps groups and organizations can do to move basic income forward? What do you see as the most effective strategies? And by moving forward, meaning more dialogue in the public sphere, more attention of policymakers. Anyone want to tackle that one? Oh, Joe.
I've been pointing at Evelyn.
I think that well, okay. Let me respond a little bit. I mean, I think we all have particular strengths and particular ways of raising this discussion in the minds of policymakers. There's certainly a great deal of interest right now in the CERB and what happens when the CERB ends, and the government is receiving briefs. And they are listening to different groups and different panels who are putting forward their ideas. So if you belong to an organization, make sure that you participate in that conversation. Make sure that those briefs are out there and that they're being heard. And as an individual, make sure that you're writing to your member of parliament. Make sure your member of parliament knows that you think that a basic income, a guaranteed livable income, is the important way forward. What you mean by that, and why you think that this is something that the government should be paying attention to. So I think this is on the radar, and I think that there are a number of ways we can raise that conversation. I think one thing that I think is really, really important is that when we're out there and having conversations with our colleagues and with our friends and with our family members, and the issue of basic income comes up and the issue of CERB comes up, I think it's really important to attack some of the stereotypes, some of the negative things that people say and that say immediately. Just as in the case of racism, we shouldn't let these ideas go unchallenged. When somebody says something that we know not to be true, we need to point them to the evidence and we need to tell them what we know. We know, for example, that basic income doesn't increase the unwillingness of people to work. We know that if there are issues with CERB, those issues have to do with the design of CERB and with the particular difficulties of the pandemic. We know that it doesn't discourage work. We know a lot of things from the work that's been done in the past and the ongoing work. So we need to challenge that. We need to challenge the stereotype that so many people have that if you are living in poverty, it's your own fault. It's a result of decisions you've made in your life, rather than recognizing the systemic issues that push people forward. And I think as individuals, that's probably the most important thing. I think that a lot of Canadians who probably haven't thought very deeply about these issues now are thinking about it because of the CERB, because people who never thought they'd be without work are now suddenly finding themselves in a position where they need a little bit of additional support. And so we need to reinforce that. We need to remind people that they found themselves in this position. It's not their fault, and that it's not the fault of other people who find themselves in difficult situations. We need to do something about the society we're living in to eliminate some of those systemic issues that cause the difficulties in the first place. So just to recap, sorry, I don't mean to turn this into a lecture, but challenge people on an individual basis. Make sure your member of parliament knows what your position is. And as a member of your group, your civil society organizations, write letters in support of the Senate initiative, for example, for a guaranteed livable income. Write open letters and make sure people know about it. Thank you.
I would just add, I think it's important people can help collect stories. Like we've been invisibilized. Poor people are not supposed to exist in Canada. So, organizations that work with a lot of low-income people who happen to be respectful of the low-income people they work with could support them in telling their stories in a dignified way, and so that people start to recognize and understand the reality and the truth of poverty in Canada.
Thank you for that. And thank you for being respectful and dignified conveying of stories and not what we call pornography at times where it's exploitive of the individual. So important. Someone earlier was talking about leisure time, and there is a question for panelists about that. How do you conceptualize and value leisure in relation to basic income beyond a commodified definition of free time? How would you tackle that? Anyone want to go for that? Someone did mention it, and I can't remember who.
I think it's important to note that leisure doesn't mean lying about. Leisure means time that you can utilize by choice. It means, if you decide that you want to learn a new hobby, or you want to pick up, a different way of growing food, or you want to, improve yourself in some form or fashion, there's many, many ways that we can spend leisure time. Leisure time is a human right, by the way. It's actually built into our human rights, because an understanding and recognition that humans are not born on this earth just to work for other people so they can make lots of money. And I want to comment on another question I saw in relation to that. This idea that people will, just take off and do nothing but lay about and drink beer and have parties or whatever. Not only does the evidence not bear that out, but I will say that, yes, there are a lot of people who refuse to do nasty jobs and unsafe conditions that are underpaid or unpaid, as happens to temporary workers a lot of the time. They don't even get paid. So yeah, the shitty jobs, people won't take them, but it's our human right to have decent jobs of livable wages and good working conditions. So, if those who exploit humans and want to continue to have the same kind of system are objecting that people won't take their nasty jobs, well, you know what? I don't really feel any sympathy for that whatsoever. So, and then in fact, we will find ourselves, I believe, when we get time to think about it, pooling our resources and starting cooperatives so that we are the owners of our businesses, so that we all benefit each other and ourselves in the conduct of economic activity, rather than being exploited workers who are completely unable to have any power in decisions in their lives. So, yeah.
Thank you. So important to mention. So the next question I'm going to actually briefly, as moderator and organizer, answer. In terms of costing, Basic Income Canada Network does have a document out that looks at how much systems cost and how much a potential basic income could cost. And it's really well spelled out. There may be other links and research. At the end of this webinar, there will be a page and a posting going out to all attendees that we can include links to that information, as well as the Ontario Basic Income Network and Basic Income Canada Network. So you can find something locally that you can participate in for sure. And just a comment in the, not just, one of the things it doesn't address is access to clean water, especially on First Nation reserve. And we absolutely agree, basic income is not a panacea for everything happening in Canada. How can a nonprofit advocate for basic income in the city and municipal region where we serve a specific neighborhood? So I think that's kind of being answered. If there's more, and does someone think we can add to that, advocating for specific neighborhoods?
Back to the story issue, a story in my neighborhood is that we've been collectively trying to develop a healthy food hub. And most people in our community just simply don't have the time and leftover energy to invest sufficiently in having, a community-based project. So, basic income is incredibly important to the voluntary sector, to, social development, in allowing people to spend the time to get together and actually do things. People want to do it, they just can't. So I think that's a really key point for nonprofits to push, is that your work relies a lot on volunteers and being able to work with people who are actually available. And when people don't have time to volunteer or even time to get help and treatment, then the work of nonprofits is entirely hindered and undermined.
Thank you for that. So our anonymous attendee has a couple of more questions. I'm going to lump them together so people just looking at time right now, so people on the panel can start thinking of answers. So the first question, how do we get federal government to buy into basic income? Are various supporters of BI speaking to government decision makers currently, especially as it could be a logical transition from CERB? That's question one. Question two is, our local MPP, who previously claimed to support BIG, now says that after CERB and local inability for certain sectors to find enough employees, i.e. farms, he now states he's not supporting it. What info do you recommend besides context working in a pandemic can't be compared to usual work environments and needs. So someone, if someone would like to address both of those.
Can I address the first one?
Sure.
I do think it's really important that we have a multi-pronged strategy, and so organizations could certainly work together with activists who are already active in this field. So being a part of the ICN, for example, OBIN right now is in the process of organizing a lobby day in October. And so being a part of that, sending out letters to their local MPs to invite them to that day, being active on that front, maybe trying to write an op-ed or something in their local newspaper, even addressing those stereotypes and issues that Evelyn raised earlier on social media, getting the word out that way, so that we see sort of a growth across various sectors and domains. To really show the government that there's, that we have wide support.
Fantastic.
Could I address the question of the difficulty of finding workers with the CERB?
Yes.
There are design issues with the CERB, and there are other issues. Many people are not in any position to go back to work because there's no childcare. There's no childcare available to them. And if you are responsible for minor children, some parent has to stay home and care for those children. So opening the economy and expecting to be able to call workers back and expecting those workers to be available without thinking about the provision of childcare is not going to work. Secondly, if an employer can't provide a safe workplace for employees, it's reasonable for workers to say, I'm not going back. And we've certainly had that happening in Western Canada with slaughterhouses, for example. These are not organizations that pay well. They pay very low wages. The working conditions are challenging at best. These organizations had difficulty finding people prepared to work even before the pandemic came along. They relied very, very heavily on temporary foreign workers, on previously incarcerated people who are there under some kind of coercion. People don't want these jobs because they're bad jobs. They have poor working conditions. They pay low wages. And I think a lot of people who were in that position before the pandemic came along are now saying, well, the CERB is responsible for the fact that I can't hire workers. Well, you couldn't hire workers before. I mean, what a basic income does, as Josephine mentioned a minute ago, it gives workers the right to walk away from exploitive jobs, from bad jobs, from low wages. It gives workers a little bit of power to say, if you want me to do that job, you're going to have to do better. You're going to have to ensure my safety. You're going to have to ensure that this is a good and reasonable place for me to work. And I do want to mention something else. We've heard a lot of unsubstantiated claims about people cheating on the CERB, about dishonesty and about fraud. We've heard very little about things that are also happening on the other side of that transaction, where employers are trying to hire workers back and forcing wage cuts on them or forcing them to work in very difficult and different situations. Now, just put yourself in the position of a restaurant. The restaurant has transformed itself from a normal restaurant into a takeout business. So all the tips that workers relied on are now gone. That's not covered, right? So workers are facing a substantial pay cut to begin with. Secondly, if employers are relying on the wage subsidy that the federal government put in place, they are encouraged but not required to come up with the additional 25% of a worker's salary.
Wow.
So they can actually try to hire workers at 75% of what they were making before, not including tips, and expect workers to come back and work under those circumstances, possibly in an unsafe environment where they can't even ensure workers' health and safety, and without any consideration that these workers might have children at home that they're trying to care for. And so they call up their MP and say, see, this CERB's a problem. Well, there are a lot of things that are a problem there, but not necessarily CERB. And if I can, I will say something about the CERB. There is a problem with the way CERB is designed. It was designed to keep people at home. It pays $2,000 a month, you're permitted to earn $1,000. If you earn $1,001, you lose the entire benefit. So if I'm a restaurant owner and I call you back to work, I say to you, please come back to work. Of course, I can't guarantee the number of hours I'm going to give you. It depends on the business I have, but take a chance on me because it's really important that we open. So you come back to work for me, you earn $1,500, lose the CERB, but are making less than you'd actually earn from the CERB if you stayed at home. So I think we do need to challenge people who are claiming the CERB is the problem. There is an issue with the CERB, and it can be very easily fixed by changing the design, by allowing people to keep a greater proportion of what they earn. But there are lots and lots of other problems that are responsible for the fact that low-wage employers are having difficulty attracting workers. And these low-wage employers need to be challenged on the working conditions that they're providing for workers and the wages that they're paying.
Thank you for that. I think we've kind of covered most of the questions in one form or another, but I'm just going to touch on a few things. When Deborah Power mentioning that she agrees this income just helps take away pressures. We're all trying, we all face trying to survive, and it gives a sense of belonging to society, not being left out because of varying different levels of poverty. And inclusion is a right as well. So there is a question of which parts of the social welfare net would basic income actually replace? And then I'm going to scroll down. Brent, I think we did answer your question about BI being a disincentive to work just by talking about CERB. I will say McMaster University did a more informal study and showed that it was not a disincentive to work. People already working started earning more money because they could take a chance and increase or change jobs with a bit of security underneath them. That the people who stopped working are the same as everyone else. People that wanted to go on maternity leave, people that wanted to go back to school, or people that had care obligations that they were paying for that they could now do themselves with immediate family members. Sorry, I shouldn't have done that as moderator, but I thought I just moved that right along. So is BI a federal mandate or a provincial mandate? And I'm just looking at the time. We have 7 minutes left, so I'm going to ask for one last answer, and then I promise that we will distribute the questions to all the panelists and have them answer, and we'll post them on the website when the video becomes available. How's that? Okay, so anyone would like to answer some of the things that have just come up? What will it replace? Sure.
We know it's going to replace welfare. There's a number of income programs that are, costly to deliver and very picky and take a lot of monitoring and policing. It will not replace the seniors benefit or the children's benefit, or at least in the model that Basic Income Canada has put forward. And as for provincial federal mandate, it could, as in the past, be a shared cost. We once upon a time had a 50-50 cost sharing agreement in Canada called the Canada Assistance Plan. And that would be my hope, is that the province and the federal government would share the costs. And I think, to another point, that it would cost too much. And the issue with modern monetary theory has been, a computer algorithm driven fraud system that has put everybody into debt slavery. And, we need to reclaim our right to public banking so that we can decide and determine what it is that we'll invest in, and we won't allow private banks' deficits and interest rates to determine our public policy. So I think, whether we get public banking or not, we can certainly afford it for many, many reasons in many ways. And all levels of government should share in making sure our basic needs are met. And modern monetary theory can hoop it. As far as I'm concerned, it's time to change that right now.
I love that. Are we going to leave it there? Anyone else want to? Because I thought that's a great closing. I think it's time for change too. So, Natasha, are you still here?
I am here. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, everybody, for sharing your insights with us today. I agree with, I think it was Josh in the chat box who said we had lots of amen moments. So if you enjoyed this webinar, you might be interested in cities responding to COVID-19 taking place on June 23rd from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. 4 of our conveners from 3 CRP member cities across Canada from Peel, from Mission, and St. John will join us with Mary Rowe to discuss how cities are collaborating and finding innovative solutions in response to the pandemic. So that link will be coming out to you with the follow-up email. And there are more free webinars still to come as we continue Tamarack's weekly webinar Wednesdays in June. So join us for free webinars and live podcasts on community change every Wednesday. The full list is available at www.tamarackcommunity.ca/event listing. Thank you, everyone, for learning with us today. Please send your questions, comments, and feedback about this webinar to me at natasha@tamarackcommunity.ca. We're always trying to improve the experience.